Well, today I'm going to be talking with Professor Tara Zahra, who was recently elected to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. She's one of 5 UChicago faculty members in this year's class, 2 of whom were also associated faculty here at the Center for East European, Russian, and Eurasian Studies. And first off, I'd just like to thank you for taking the time to speak with us today.
Well, thank you for taking the time to interview me.
So I thought it might be appropriate to start our conversation with the mission statement of the Academy, which is in part to champion useful knowledge. In your opinion, what constitutes useful knowledge, and how do you see your work creating knowledge that is useful?
That's a great question. It's a hard question for historians. I think one thing that's always true, no matter what field you're in, especially if you're trying to write a bit for a slightly broader public, which I've been doing, is that you can't really control how your work is used or how it's received. But I was pretty conscious when I was working on my last book, at least, and the projects I'm thinking about now, of the contemporary refugee crisis and the history of migration as a political issue in this country and in Europe, and the current debates about migration. And so I guess I hope that one way that my recent work will be useful, or could be useful, is that it might show how a lot of the negative tropes that are assigned to refugees today, the image of migrants or refugees as welfare parasites, as a threat to security, as incapable of integration or assimilation, are very old tropes that sort of come up again and again. And I hope that history maybe will, and it's a history that has shaped most families in the United States, at least, that it might give some people pause to think about contemporary migrants in a more sympathetic way. But other than that, in some ways, I hope that my work is useful in that it inspires people to think about the past in a different way, and maybe then helps them to think about the present world that we live in a slightly different way as well.
Yeah.
I don't know if I've achieved that, but that's the goal, at least.
Nice. Well, you mentioned your most recent book, The Great Departure, and I was wondering to what extent you see it as your third book and your past work kind of united by a common intellectual project, or if it would be doing too much injustice to your work to reduce all 3 books to a common denominator. Right. Could you maybe speak to how your intellectual project has evolved over the years?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, too. I think when I started writing the last book, I thought I was making this major departure, in that a great departure.
Yeah.
In that I had decided I really did not want to write about children again, not because I don't think it's interesting, but because I thought I'd kind of said what I had to say. But I was still very interested in migration. But it seemed like I was entering into new terrain. But there was a review of the book recently by John Connolly, who's a historian of Eastern Europe at Berkeley. And he wrote that I had just written the 3rd part of a trilogy.
I was struck by that.
Right,
yeah,
which
I read
had
that, and that's
never
what actually inspired this question, because I hadn't thought of them before as a
No,
as a
I
unit
hadn't
like
either.
that.
And then I sort of worried, oh, well, maybe I am just saying the same thing over and over again. But I do think what unites the 3 books, I mean, maybe he pointed this out, but as I thought about it as well, is a kind of focus on population politics and on how states and mass political movements, especially over the course of the late 19th and 20th century, have attempted to manipulate population in various ways, whether it's family politics or migration politics. And also, at the same time, the way in which ordinary people, it's a problematic phrase, but normal people have kind of resisted those efforts or proved to be maybe less amenable to state efforts to transform them. I think my work also, probably all three books, focus in one way or another on how mass politics and the state intersect with everyday life in various ways. And you can see that really clearly in the history of the family and childhood, and also in the history of migration.
Yeah. Could you maybe tell us a bit about your current projects? I'm sure we're all very
Right.
excited to hear more about those.
Yes. So I'm starting a new project, which I again imagine is it feels like a great departure, but is probably not in the end. And this one really is very inspired by, if you can say that, contemporary politics. I guess there's been a lot of discussion among academics, especially people who study 20th century Europe and East Central Europe, about the extent to which Trump and other right-wing political leaders in Europe and elsewhere in the world resemble interwar fascists. And I started to think that maybe that discussion isn't so useful, in part because it comes down to a semantic debate about what fascism is, which we both know is kind of doesn't really get you very far. But I was really interested in thinking about underlying similarities and differences between the political and social conditions of the interwar period and today. And it led me toward thinking about deglobalization, which is the project I'm currently starting to work on. I mean, it was something I'd already been thinking about in my earlier work on migration, since one of the things I was so focused on is efforts to stop migration, not only on the side of countries that were receiving migrants, but also the countries that were sending migrants, the ways in which, particularly after 1918, the world's borders closed. But I've kind of, and I think I'll continue to think about that one aspect of deglobalization in the interwar period. But I'm also interested in autarky. It doesn't seem like a very sexy term, but what I'm kind of interested in is how states and individuals in the interwar period and social movements tried to liberate themselves from dependence on the global economy, and how that kind of affected everyday life, again, and politics. And I've gotten particularly interested in these autarkic settlement movements, which kind of span the entire political spectrum. There's socialist versions, there's communist versions, and there's right-wing versions, which envisioned kind of liberating countries from global trade and the global economy by creating these self-sufficient rural communities. And it's striking that a lot of the countries that became most invested in these kinds of movements were places that didn't have their own empires or had just lost empires. So they saw this intercolonization as a kind of alternative to formal colonization and empire. So that's what I'm starting on. I think in some ways it's a necessary corrective to a movement I've been part of, to look at history transnationally, which we might talk about a little bit more, but in some ways, what's been going on in the present has made me see the past in a different way. Usually we think about it the other way, that we study history in order to understand the present, but the present can also change the way we think about the past. And one thing that's changed for me is that I have come to see that we need to think about internationalism, globalization, transnationalism as something with many more stops and starts. I mean, it's obvious that it's not a teleological process, but to look at a period like the interwar period where people just said, okay, enough is enough. You know, we don't want to be connected to the rest of the world anymore, and understand why and how and what the effects were. That's kind of what I'm trying to do. We'll see how it goes.
Yeah, that sounds great. So you mentioned this kind of larger transnational framework, and your research notably connects the histories of East and Central Europe to that of Western Europe and the United States in often surprising ways. And while such a European scope is not unheard of, it is rather uncommon for specialists on Eastern Europe. I was wondering if you could tell us a bit about what led you to such a larger European scope in your work.
Yeah, I think it's become more common, and I think it has a lot to do with generation, kind of
Mhm.
when you come into the field. At the risk, I guess I'm going to reveal my age. I was 13 when communism ended, and I've
Mhm.
never been in a communist Eastern Europe.
Mhm.
So I think I came into the field without the assumption that Eastern Europe was linked, first of all, to Russia, which is how it had been pretty much studied up until the 90s. I mean, still, it was pretty common to think of Russian Eastern Europe as a field rather than think of East Central Europe or Eastern Europe as part of European history. And so I didn't have that assumption, and I went to a graduate program where I studied mostly with German historians and not really with Russian historians at all. So the questions I was asking were already coming from a bit from another field. I think, since I was also in grad school and starting to formulate my first project in the late 90s and early 2000s, that was when Europe was expanding, and that all looked like it was going pretty well at the time.
Yeah.
So it also just seemed at the time that it was kind of a moment to think about integrating East European history into broader into European history more broadly, which is something that seems quite obvious right now, but I'm not sure was so obvious at the time. So I think intellectually that's where I was coming from. I might have also, just on a personal level, been affected by the fact that I didn't come into the field so much through an area studies perspective. I'd never been to Prague or even to Austria at the moment that I decided to go to graduate school to study the field. So and I love those places, and I feel passionate about them as places and having deep knowledge about them. But the questions that motivated me were generally broader questions, and I thought of Central Europe as an interesting place to study those questions rather than wanting first and foremost to understand the place, if that makes sense. So maybe that affected it as well. But
makes a lot of sense. Could you maybe tell us a bit more about the specific ways in which studying Eastern Europe has kind of shaped and enriched your understanding of society and politics in Western Europe and the United States?
Yeah, I mean, this is, I guess, maybe where I have a bit of field-based pride.
Yeah.
I think I do feel like when I came into the field, in general, East Europeanists were kind of taking questions from West European history and applying them to East European history. It's like, well, they did gender history, now we'll do gender history. Or, they did cultural history, let's try that here. I think increasingly, or at least I hope, that work by scholars of the Habsburg Empire and East Central Europe is, I think, shedding new light on bigger questions that are of interest to historians of Europe and the world more generally. Nationalism is the obvious field where I think, our field has been at the forefront of developing new perspectives and approaches, but empire is another one, borderlands. In general, the kind of history of how societies have dealt with religious, cultural, linguistic diversity. Also, you could think about issues of the experience of war and dictatorship, of the history of sovereignty. There are a lot of questions where I think in the last 10 to 15 years at least, we have been a little bit more ahead of the game, setting agendas rather than just imitating what's been done elsewhere. At least that's my hope. So.
Yeah, mine too.
Yeah.
Great. Well, we're, I think, running out of time. But just to conclude, I was wondering if you could maybe recommend 3 books to our audience, maybe books that are particularly inspiring for you in your work, or books you just think that anyone should read.
Yeah. I was glad I got warning about this question because it's such a hard one. And
It's very
if
difficult.
you'd asked me just on the spur of the moment, I never would have been able to answer it. I still can't answer it well because there's so many good books.
Yeah.
But I sort of picked 3 in different genres and these are books that I keep finding myself assigning over and over again, at least in the last few years. So I don't think this is an eternal list, but it's a current it's a current list. The first one actually is Kate Brown's Plutopia.
Oh, yeah.
I've taught 2 graduate courses recently where I signed it. I just think it's a brilliant book. I think it's a model of how to do great transnational and comparative history. It's a page turner. It's politically engaged historical writing, which is something I aspire to do, and it's beautifully written and researched. So I don't think it's a book I could have ever produced, but I wish I'd written it. You know,
Yeah,
when you have
sure.
that feeling, I wish I'd written a book. That's fun.
Really checks all the
It
boxes.
checks all the boxes. And it's also a case where, I mean, that's a book by an East Europeanist that's won every single award in U.S. history.
Yeah.
So the fact there is a case concretely where somebody coming, you know, from the East European side has taught American historians something new about their own history, about the history of plutonium and nuclear power. It's great. I also have to put in a plug for Peter Judson's New History of the Habsburg Empire.
Oh, yes.
In full honesty, he is my undergraduate advisor and got me into the field, but he has just written this brand new, beautiful history of the empire that's designed for a general reader, but I think should be a new starting point for undergraduates, graduate students, and also anybody out there who happens to be interested in the Habsburg Empire for whatever reason. So I hope a lot of people will read it, and I know I'll be assigning it for a long time. And then I wanted to think more. I guess I thought, you know, a book that just came to mind because I keep citing it everywhere, like in every article I write lately, and also I keep assigning it in all the classes I read. Is Joseph Roth's The Wandering Jews.
Oh, really? Yeah.
So now getting back, not kind of historiography, but more of a primary source. But this is a book that's about refugees, migration, Jews, Central Europe, America. And there's so many, I mean, it's a very depressing book in some ways, but there's so many beautiful insights that I think, if for a reader today, help us to think about contemporary migration politics and the refugee crisis. It seems very timely in a lot of ways, and contemporary politics as well. So I don't know. I think that's one that's just going to keep appearing on my syllabi for a while, for better or for worse.
No, sounds great. Well, I think that's all the time we have now, but thank you very much for speaking with us.
Thank you. Yeah.
Quite enjoyable.
Thank you for the fantastic questions.